as I said earlier, the Bruins and the NHL in general are gearing up for the trade deadline on Friday, March 6th. And so today, Don Sweeney spoke with media at Warrior Ice Arena and talked about the Bruins trade deadline approach. And I want to get to some of his comments in a second, but just generally speaking, you have to remember heading into this deadline that Boston were major sellers last year. They may have been the premier sellers at last year's deadline. They traded away Brad Marchand. They traded away Charlie Coyle, Brandon Carlo, Trent Frederick, Justin Brazeau. Am I missing anybody? I think those were the big ones, right? Obviously, but I'm trying to think if there's anything smaller. Either way, they recouped multiple draft picks, multiple prospects. And, it was just a very, very much needed recuperation of assets. You go on to draft James Hagens, 7th overall, who at the time that you sold all those pieces at the deadline was projected to be a top 3 pick at the draft. He falls to you at 7, even though you finished 5th overall in the lottery. Before the lottery, you fell to 7th, and you still get Hagens. Zellers has been an amazing prospect. We'll get to those names in a second. But basically what I'm saying is the Bruins did such a good job at recuperating picks and prospects just 1 year ago. Don't fuck it up now, right? Like don't get overzealous now. Don't fall in love with trying to, I'm wary that the Bruins, or before Sweeney's comments today, I'll say, I was wary that the Bruins were going to do something stupid. I don't necessarily feel that way right now. So let's get into Sweeney's opening comments, and then we will go from there.
Likelihood would be a little different than last year. Not necessarily as aggressive and active, but we would like to continue to improve our hockey club if possible, and exploring opportunities to do so with the intention of obviously giving our team that has done a pretty good job so far. Our coaches, players, staff, attention to the power play, some of the areas that we identified going into this year, and being much more competitive. We'd like to give them a bump because they've earned that, but it's an eye towards, obviously this year, but moving forward as well. So that's what our intentions are as we go to the deadline, and that may or may not come to fruition, but we're going to explore them and see what presents. I respect when Morgan Geekie and players speak out that they would like the opportunity to continue to move forward with their group, because they've done a good job.
All right. So, listen, my opinion is that the Bruins are playing with house money right now. They're in a playoff position right now. I don't want to say comfortably, but you have a 3-point lead in the Caps and you have 3 games in hand. So they're really going to have to collapse, I think, down the stretch to fall out of the playoff position. Now, with that said, Sweeney's saying that they're not going to be overly aggressive. I think that's kind of that's what you want to hear. My read on this is that they aren't going to do anything crazy. I think there's really one name out there up front that the Bruins, if they're serious about acquiring him, if he's available, would be willing to part with some significant assets for. We talked about him last episode, and we'll get to it in a little bit. But, the Bruins, not only are they currently in a playoff spot as it stands, but you have James Hagens, you have Dean Letourneau, you have Will Zellers, you have Cooper Simpson, you have 5 first-round draft picks in the next couple of years. You have 3 second-round draft picks. You have, some younger players in Providence, like a Matt Poitras, who, could still be something. Fabian, like you have a lot of players and prospects. What you don't have are right-handed defense prospects. But as far as forwards go, the Bruins are in a good spot right now with prospects and futures. So you don't have to do anything crazy if you don't want to. Okay, now let's get to a comment from Sweeney here, who was asked about if he would be, willing to part with some first-round draft picks, because again, they've recuperated so much, right? There's an element here of don't forget the big picture here. Now, what's tough is that you still have to appease your current players and your current core, right? I mean, you heard Morgan Geekie say, and Sweeney even addressed that comment right now in this clip I just played, where Morgan Geekie said that he thinks the Bruins, they've played well enough to deserve the management group to invest in them and buy for them, right? David Pastrnak said the same thing after practice today. He's proud of the group and he thinks that the Bruins should be buying for them. Now, there's levels to that. But what's interesting is the Bruins have no interest in being in the rental market, right? And nor should they. This team, you're not parting with futures for any sort of rentals. It's not happening. So I do get the feeling that Don Sweeney is going to try to make his current core players happy by investing somehow, some way. What does that mean, though? Right? And if he's not going to part with some key assets, then what return of any significance can he really bring back to Boston? Right. So we'll get to that in a second, but let's get to this Don Sweeney comment first about the willingness or the reluctancy of potentially parting with some draft collateral that the Bruins have recently acquired.
Don, there's been so much talk today, obviously, about James and about Dean, and you do have 4 first-round picks. And when you look at where you are right now and the building that you still have to do you have a bit more reluctance to trade those first-round picks, given how rare they've been for the organization over the last 10 years or so?
Again, the right deal has to come along. If the right deal presents that it's helping our club now and moving forward, then we have to explore and look at that. And that's part of the jobs that our scouts do a really good job, to push the envelope, to say, hey, does this make sense for us now and moving forward? You're not wrong in the fact that we spent likely had too much collateral assets to try and win. I'm not going to apologize for trying to win. I'm going to apologize if we haven't won. But being in a position to try and go for it, that's what this organization wants to be back in. And we'll use them, hopefully, as effectively as we possibly can to do that. I'm not anxiously, aggressively doing it, but if it presents, I have to ask the questions as who's available and whether or not those assets will allow us to acquire the player. That has to be paramount and part of the job.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you this, Don Sweeney would be a great politician. He does a really good job of saying a lot and at the same time saying absolutely nothing. But that's to be expected. I don't think GMs are accustomed to really being super transparent with the media, especially during trade deadline week, about where their mindset really is, because you don't want to give much away, which is kind of funny that's why when you hear certain GMs that do go off the radar and do say too much, it's very noticeable. It's like, ooh, you shouldn't have said that. I'm trying to think of who it is in Vancouver, but I'm blanking right now. But the Canucks GM and president, is it Jim Rutherford? I don't want to get that wrong. But in any event, people in Vancouver the last couple of years have been very transparent with their ongoings and talking about, Quinn Hughes and JT Miller and Elias Pettersson at times and others, and just putting their foot in their mouths and saying too much. Don Sweeney is certainly not going to say too much. I do think he gives Bruins media enough to keep them coming back to the well, but also enough to keep them hungry too. So in any event, listen, I think there are certain players out there I just don't think the Bruins are going to be giving up first round draft picks for, or top prospects. And here are some of those names off the top of my head. These names have been linked to the Bruins in one way, shape, or form. And take things with a grain of salt, because trade deadline season is all about articles and clicks, and sometimes insiders are fed information from agents and or GMs to use them as puppets, right? Sometimes they're fed information that's not even, they're being fed the information, but they might be being fed the information to put something out there to maybe try to leverage a situation on behalf of an agent or a team. So there's always an angle, especially with insiders and whatnot. But Nazem Kadri, I'm not giving up a first round pick or a top prospect for him. Braden Shen, same thing. Not giving up a top end prospect or draft pick for Braden Shen. Why? Because they're center icemen that are in, their early mid 30s, and it's just the Bruins don't need to do that. You just don't. If the Bruins want to acquire a true top 6 forward, that player should be in their prime or younger. And by the way, I think that there's a difference for the Bruins. There's a different threshold for them when it comes to the age of a right shot defenseman that they're willing to acquire versus the age of a top 6 forward. And I'll get to that in a second. But Braden Shen, Nazem Kadri, all set. Not giving up first round picks or top prospects for them. Nor am I doing that for Justin Falk. There's a rumor out there that Doug Armstrong wants a Justin Falk, a Rasmus Anderson type return for Justin Falk. Rasmus Anderson started with a first round draft pick from Vegas. They sent Zachary Whitecloud. Like, the Bruins are not sending St. Louis a first round pick and a roster player plus for Justin Falk. It's not happening. Rasmus Ristolainen, not giving a first round pick for Ristolainen. Tyler Myers, not doing it for Tyler Myers. Connor Garland, I said last episode, I would just wait on him until free agency. If you really want the player that bad, he's not going to re-sign in Vancouver. Just take a swing at him in free agency if you really want him that bad. But I don't think Connor Garland to me is just, again, you have young forwards coming up. I think, you want to address center ice if you can. So anyway, the list goes on, but there are certain players out there you see linked to the Bruins and every team where it doesn't make sense for me, for the Bruins to give up a first round pick or top prospects for them. There are a couple of examples out there where if you're the Bruins, maybe you would entertain giving up some of your top prospects or, maybe a first round pick or two for the right deal. And let's get to that now, because I mentioned earlier that there's one name out there in my mind that would be worth really giving up a lot for if the team was serious about trading him. And to me, that's Robert Thomas. Okay, now we talked about Robert Thomas last episode, and his name continues to be out there. Now, I'm not saying he's going to go to Boston, but there's some serious smoke to the Robert Thomas trade fire, and he's been linked to Utah. He's been linked to potentially Montreal. There was somebody else I think that he was linked to as well, but I think it's a real possibility that the Blues trade him. Elliot Friedman was on 32 Thoughts earlier this morning, and he mentioned that with Doug Armstrong getting ready to step down as GM for the St. Louis Blues, and with Alex Steen getting ready to assume the role and the position of GM for the Blues, that Doug Armstrong might do some serious house cleaning at this year's deadline. Oh, by the way, with Alex Steen very much having a say in it, but kind of behind the scenes. And that Doug Armstrong does some house cleaning this trade deadline so that it's not on Alex Steen's tenure, right? Like, we're going to do X, Y, Z while I'm GM so that people can't blame you when you're GM, right? You won't get the heat. And so potentially moving a guy like Robert Thomas or Colton Parayko or Jordan Kyrou, Justin Falk, a lot like these names that are really out there to be on the trade block for the Blues. It feels like Doug Armstrong is trying to get what he can for certain assets, because I think the Blues, I don't know what St. Louis is trying to do. I don't know if they're trying to do a full rebuild or a retool on the fly, because if it's a retool on the fly, I think Robert Thomas should still be there. But in any event, we'll see what happens. So Robert Thomas, to me, is the one guy that if you're Don Sweeney and the Bruins and you have an opportunity to trade for him, you have to really understand that you have to give to get. And to get a player like Robert Thomas, who's a true 1C in his prime, you're going to have to give. Okay, so with that said, which Bruins prospects do you think are untouchable? Or which Bruins assets? It could be a combination. It could be draft picks. It could be prospects. Are there any Bruins prospects and or assets that are untouchable? So let's stick with Robert Thomas right now, okay? For Robert Thomas, and this is my personal opinion, you don't have to agree with it. The only untouchable asset for the Bruins, in my opinion, even if it's Robert Thomas, is James Hagens. I know that there are fans out there and Bruins media members who would say that James Hagens and a Robert Thomas trade would not be untouchable. That's fine. I'm not here to dissuade anybody. If I'm answering the question about who is untouchable for the Bruins or what's untouchable for the Bruins, it starts with James Hagens and the list ends there. Okay. For the right acquisition. Now, Robert Thomas is the only player that I would even give up any of Boston's top assets for. I just wouldn't do Hagens. Hagens, if the Bruins want Robert Thomas, you got to find a way to do it without Hagens. I'm sorry, but that's or else don't do it. And I know that's crazy because I know the argument is, whoa. Robert Thomas is 26 and he's had back-to-back 80-point seasons. He could be a 100-point guy, and he's a true 1C. What do you mean you wouldn't give up Hagens for that? No, I know. I go back and forth. Like I understand the rationale. No, Hagens may never be that. Hagens may be half of that. I know. Listen, I just think that Hagens is 18 years old or 19 now, but I want to see Hagens in the Boston Bruins jersey. I'm sorry, I do. And if that makes me a homer who's falling in love with a hometown asset, then so be it. Okay? Because the other part of it too is I think the Bruins could, if they wanted to, I think they could probably get Thomas without giving up Hagens. Now, don't get me wrong. Doug Armstrong's first ask to Sweeney will be, all right, well, we want Hagens. And Don's going to sit there and say, oh, well, Doug, we appreciate the offer, but, how about Letourneau and Poitras and 2 firsts and Lohrei? Like he's going to do something like that. I don't see Hagens actually going anywhere, even in a Thomas trade. I just don't see it, okay? But beyond that, if the Bruins could truly get Robert Thomas, then Dean Letourneau has to be on the table. Will Zellers would have to be on the table. I love Zellers. And Letourneau is an awesome prospect right now. The notion of him right now is a very exciting prospect to be in Boston. Same with Zellers. I think Zellers, he's going to have another year at North Dakota next season. And then after that, we'll see. But I think Zellers could be a top 6 forward too one day. I mentioned Cooper Simpson earlier. He's got 30 goals, 37 assists, 67 points in 52 games in the USHL. Now, I know the USHL isn't the CHL, and I know it's not even NCAA hockey, but he's a very promising forward prospect as well. He's years away. He's going to go to North Dakota next season. But again, Cooper Simpson, if he's part of a package for Robert Thomas, it's like, yes, right? And then, first-round picks, right? Boston's first-round pick in 26 from Toronto, it's top 5 protected, and right now it's a 10th overall pick, pre-lottery. Toronto is probably going to sell at the deadline. They're going to look at what the Bruins did last year, where the Bruins fleeced them for Carlo, and they're going to say, hey, you know what? Look what the Bruins did last year. Let's try and do that this year. And, the result might be Toronto finishing, again, like with the 6th, 7th, 8th overall pick pre-lottery. So that first-round pick for the Bruins, who are in desperate need of a right-shot defenseman organizationally, a top 4 right-shot defenseman, I think that pick is going to be extremely valuable. And if they get Toronto, they have Toronto's first-round pick this coming June. But if that pick ends up being between 6 and 10, guys, who knows who could fall to them? Like nobody predicted James Hagens going 7th overall this past June, last March, right? Like crazy things can happen. Like if the Bruins had the 6th overall pick, let's call it, from Toronto, do I think Gavin McKenna falls to 6? No, right? But you just don't know who falls to them. And so, I think the Bruins have 2 first-round picks this year and a great draft, a deep draft too. You have to draft the best player available. So if it's a right-shot defenseman, it's a right-shot defenseman. If it's a center or a winger, whatever. But I do think that with one of their first 2 picks in 26, it will be a right shot defenseman. So I think that, and that's a huge organizational need. So I think that after James Hagens, your most valuable asset is probably that 26 first round pick from Toronto, because it could be a lottery pick or just outside the lottery. All right. I think where you start to get a little bit more flexible with, okay, you know what, you can't hoard everything, you may have to give to get, is okay, if the Bruins can bring in a true top 6 forward in their prime, right? Like a Jordan Kyrou or Robert Thomas, you can't get stingy on Boston's 2026 first round pick or any of their picks in 27 or 28. Like, hell, even if you wanted Robert Thomas, I do think Toronto's pick would have to go for sure, especially if Hagens isn't involved. Then yeah, you can't be unrealistic. There's no world, I don't think, where the Bruins could trade for Robert Thomas without giving up both, or without giving up at least one of Hagens or the 26th first round pick from Toronto. Something's got to give, right? And to be fair, for a player like Robert Thomas, who I'm surprised is on the move potentially. Had it not been for any of these articles coming out the last week or so, I would have thought Robert Thomas was a long-term, center for St. Louis, and maybe he still will be. I'm surprised to see his name out there, but regardless, I think that you'd have to be willing to give to get. Outside of Robert Thomas, I'm not moving that 26th first round pick from Toronto. Even for a Jordan Kyrou, like, nah, try and move one of your other picks and some other prospects. I think that some other players that I would be willing to at least part with one of Boston's lesser first round picks would be for a Colton Parayko, maybe, or a Mackenzie Weegar. And the reason why is I mentioned earlier that I think the Bruins have a different threshold for what they'd be willing to give up for a right shot defenseman. Or let me rephrase that. I think the Bruins have a different threshold for the age of a right shot defenseman they'd bring in versus the age of a top 6 forward. I don't think the Bruins are interested in bringing in a 3-year-old top 6 forward for a first round draft pick, at least. Like, I don't think they'll do that because they do have some good young forward prospects on the way. But because they don't have any top 4 right shot defensemen organizationally beyond McAvoy, like if we're talking true talent, they have to draft it because free agency is not the avenue anymore. Most players will just re-sign wherever they are with the cap going up. So I think that the Bruins look at right shot defense and they say, okay, we won't be able to draft that player until at least this June. And maybe they play next year, but chances are they're at least a year or 2 away. And so maybe we'd be more willing to give up not Toronto's 26 first round pick, and maybe not even Boston's 26 first round pick, but maybe one of their picks in 27 or 28. Maybe we'd be willing to give up one of those for a 32-year-old Colton Parayko or a 32-year-old Mackenzie Weegar, because those guys will still be very serviceable top 4 defensemen for the next 3-4 seasons. And we don't have that prospect ready yet. And maybe he'll be ready in a couple of years, but he's not right now. So I think the Bruins will be willing to part with one of their lesser first round picks for a true top 4 defenseman, even if he's a little bit older, more so than they'd be willing to part with a lesser first round pick for a 32, 33-year-old center, like a Braden Schenner and Nazem Kadri. Okay. So beyond James Hagens, who I think, like I said, I think he's my only untouchable. Now, untouchable is a strong word, because if somebody came to me and said, "Oh, well, Brian, you wouldn't trade him for Connor McDavid?" Like, okay, yes, like I would trade James Hagens for Connor McDavid. He wouldn't be untouchable in that situation. But realistically speaking, with the names that we're hearing out there right now, I think he's pretty much untouchable. Beyond him, I think that for the right player, like Robert Thomas, I would trade a Dean Letourneau, but I would do it, not happy, but I would do it because you have to give to get. Same with the Will Zellers or Cooper Simpson or a 26 first round pick, right? I would pretty much give St. Louis not all of our assets, but I would give them a couple of our big assets for Robert Thomas. Beyond Robert Thomas, I'm not touching pretty much any of Boston's top prospects or top draft picks. I would relinquish maybe Boston's own pick in 26, maybe, but beyond Robert Thomas, I don't think I would. Even like a Jordan, maybe a Jordan Kyrou, right? If somebody said, Brian, would you trade Matt Poitras and Boston's 26 first round pick for Jordan Kyrou? I think I would say, you still have Toronto's? Yep. Okay. Then maybe, yeah. And then, maybe for the right top right shot defenseman, I would trade one of their picks in 27 or 28, along with like a prop, whatever else it gets the deal done. So, what about you guys? Like, what do you think should be untouchable for the Bruins? Should all of their 5 first round picks in the next 3 years be untouchable? Should all of their top prospects be untouchable? What do you think? And obviously there's no rush right now. Like, the Bruins don't have to do anything. Okay, they can sit back, relax, and maybe they can reevaluate things and see where the season goes and talk to teams closer to the draft. Okay, that's always a possibility. But with the trade deadline, you always have teams trying to get things done, and they're trying to go in different directions and recuperate, picks and prospects if they're trying to rebuild or retool. And